In class, we discussed what happens in long-run adjustments in perfect competition. To review for a moment, in perfectly competitive markets, the price is set by the supply and demand in the industry, and that price is delivered as a perfectly elastic marginal revenue line, also called the demand line, to the individual firm. The intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost will determine the output level of the individual firm. However, if, for example, demand increases in the market, trying to increase just demand and it's not letting me shift demand. Okay, so demand increases in the market, and now we have a new price which is transmitted to the individual firm, and the individual firm now has a higher output level and profits. As we discussed, that will result in attracting new firms into the industry and result ultimately in an increase in supply. Supply will increase, possibly by a little bit at first, possibly too much, but eventually the supply curve will shift so that it intersects right here, because the long-run equilibrium position is at the minimum ATC. So ultimately, the price is going to find its way back to minimum ATC. As a result of this, and I'm going to erase for a moment so that I can clarify on this graph, as a result of this, we can also make reference to a long-run industry supply curve. In the short run, the industry supply curve is determined by all of these corn farmers deciding how much corn to grow. But if demand increases, resulting in an increase in supply, and we ultimately end up with this new equilibrium point, okay, you can see this long-run supply curve is going to develop through a series of short-run changes. Okay, and the long-run supply curve here is shown as a horizontal line. What this implies is that each time demand in the industry increases, okay, in the short run there will be profits, but the long-run adjustment is that there's increased firms in the industry, so we end up with essentially the same amount of supply at the equilibrium price as we had before. This represents what we call a constant cost industry. Okay, if you look at that constant cost, what that means is no matter how much the industry expands, the cost curves over here stay essentially the same. Okay, why do they stay the same? Because the resources are not particularly scarce, but the increased production also doesn't result in any increased efficiencies. Most industries are going to be constant cost industries. However, we might occasionally see the situation where we have what we call an increasing cost industry. Okay, and in an increasing cost industry, what that means is that as we see this continued increased demand, increased supply, increased demand, increased supply trend, resources become more scarce. And as resources become more scarce, the costs to individual firms start to rise. So the ABC line, for example, might shift up because workers might become more scarce. A TC line might shift up. Okay, and as those lines shift, because of the increasing price of increasingly scarce resources, the price in the market ultimately is going to shift as well. And what we'll see is, rather than having this long-run supply curve that looks like this, what we'll see is a long-run supply curve that looks something more like this. Okay? So if, as we expand output in an industry, if that causes resources to become more scarce and more expensive, in other words, if it's an increasing cost industry, the long-run supply curve will actually begin to creep upwards. It is also possible to see a decreasing cost industry. An example of that is an industry where, for example, in the cell phone industry, when cell phones were originally being produced, the component parts were quite expensive. But as the industry increased and more firms began producing cell phones, more and more firms began producing component parts, and the cost of the component parts actually went down. So that would be a decreasing cost industry where it actually became more efficient over time. Average costs for firms began to drop, average total costs, average variable costs dropped, and the long-run supply curve also began to slope downwards. So the larger the industry got, the lower the costs in the industry. This information is also included in your textbook. There's a pretty good explanation of it on page 602.